Welcome to the Power of Partnership podcast. I'm Riane Eisler, President of the Center for Partnership Systems. This podcast brings you voices from the partnership movement, people using partnership practices to build a world that values caring, nature, and shared prosperity. The Power of Partnership podcast is hosted by Cherry Jacobs-Pruitt, a health policy and partnership scholar. Today, Cherry interviews Alfonso Montuori. He's a researcher and author, a consultant, an expert on creativity, and founder of the Center for Creative Futures. And now on to the podcast.
Welcome, Alfonso. On behalf of Riane Eisler and the entire Center for Partnership Systems team, I want to thank you for being on the Power of Partnership show today. I'm so excited to be talking to you today about the promises of partnership-based thinking in leadership, innovation, and creativity. So, Alfonso, you are the founder of the Center for Creative Futures within the California Institute of Integral Studies. Can you share a bit about the hows and whys of how this center was founded?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say it's a pleasure and an honor to be on the show. So thank you for inviting me. Yes, I've been interested in the future for a very long time now, about 40 years or so, and it just seems like these days when we look around, all the images in the media, in movies, in books, all the images of the futures are heavily dystopian. And frankly, there's just not a lot to look forward to. There are any number of different catastrophes and problems and other seemingly unsolvable situations that it's really taking a toll on people, and particularly young people. I mean, the rate of mental health issues for young people has shot up. Some young couples are not having kids because of environmental anxiety. Some young people are just not saving because they think, why? The world's going to go to hell anyway. Let's party like it's, 1999 for those of us who were around in those days. But it's a very serious question, and I think a lot of the discourse about the future has been about technology, and that's great. But I'm really interested in sort of the psychosocial dimension, how to give people a sense of agency and a sense that they sort of have an understanding of what's happening in the world, and the sense that they can make a difference. It's very much related to Riane's project because there are a lot of critiques of what's wrong with the world, but we don't see a lot of alternatives. So there are critiques of what Riane would call the dominator system, but people don't have a sense that there's a partnership alternative. So the partnership framework is very important in the context of this center because it suggests that people can relate to each other in a different way. And it's not some kind of feel-good story of, we all love each other and we're all going to get along. But there's a sense that, yes, look, it's possible. People are doing it here and here and here. And historically, this has happened. And it gives people a framework to move in a different kind of direction, in a positive direction that isn't a win-lose direction where somebody's got to lose out. It's like, how are we going to work together to create a better world? And the word create there means partnership requires creativity. right? Because we don't always immediately see, well, how are we going to create a situation where everybody benefits? Well, that takes creativity. So in some respects, that's sort of at the heart of the center.
Beautiful. So what does the center look like? If I was a student coming into the center, what can I expect to experience?
Yes. Well, right now, we have a PhD program, transformative studies, and a leadership master's degree, transformative leadership. And within those two programs, it's possible to take a set of courses that focus on the future. But what will follow from that is research projects. We hope to go out and engage young people and talk to them about the future and listen to what they want in the world. You know, we've spent a lot of time, I think, talking about what we don't want. You know, whether we don't want environmental devastation, we don't want racism. Some people don't want woke, whatever it is. People have strong feelings about what they don't want. But what do we want? You know, what is it that people would really like to see in the world? And I think that's one of the questions that we have to. I'm not going to tell people what they want. I want to find out what is it that people really care about, what matters to them. And my experience so far is that actually, when we look at what people want, it's a lot more similar and breaks down some of the barriers that we might think are unsurmountable. Because in many respects, people want the same thing.
So can you share some stories about how past graduates from the program how they're using their degrees, either their PhD or their master's degree, out in the world?
Yeah, it's because the degrees are transdisciplinary. So we have people from a very wide range of backgrounds. People are using it in everything from creating their own consulting firms to running nonprofits to teaching to setting up journals. You know, Teddy Potter, who has been very successful and is a wonderful person, has really made a strong contribution because a partnership is such an integral part of the Creative Futures idea and curriculum, if you will. It's just become part of how they see the world, and I think that's very important. It's a big transition because I think sometimes we don't realize how people are locked in to the dominator mentality, even if they're against it, because it's like, well, what's the alternative, right? And I think to be able to spend time to really study what partnership is, to apply it, to see how other people have developed the ideas, but also the practices, because that's the really important thing. It's how do you apply this in your everyday life, right? Not just as a leader, but it's got to be throughout your life, because we don't want the person who is like, well, I'm a great partnership leader, and then behaves badly at home, right? And there's plenty of those, right? Or, you know, we know that a lot of nonprofits also, I think because of the stress, because of the amount of work that's needed, can become very exploitative. And so how do you deal with all that? So it's a complex question, but it's a question that our students are really interested in exploring, and I think they're all really excited. And I could tell when Riane just came to talk the other day, there was a real sense of excitement with the students that they had a chance to interact with her and ask her questions, and it sort of motivates them to be even more involved in the whole project. And yeah, it's a real driver, put it that way.
That's lovely. And I'll share with our listeners that Teddy Potter, who Alfonso just referenced, there's several different podcast episodes featuring her work. One is Healing Healthcare, another is on interplanetary health, and then a third is on the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies that she helped co-found with Riane. And so that episode has the story of the journal and really the role that the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies has held in being a gate opener for other open access journals across the world, which is really a very partnership-based way of running a journal and having access.
Yeah, it's terrific to see that. I mean, I think I may have mentioned to you, I met Riane in '88, just as the Chalice and the Blade was gathering momentum, as it were, and over the years we've co-authored some articles, and creativity is one of my main research interests. And Riane, the first time we met, this was in '88, she said, "Well, you should look at creativity in women." And honestly, it had never occurred to me, but it really opened up a whole world, and to this day, honestly, somewhat shamefully, there's still very little research on creativity in women, comparatively speaking, right? But the whole approach to looking at creativity in women was very foundational for me, because it opened up a lot of perspective. So, for instance, if you look at the lists of creative geniuses that are typically made up, you'll see that there are not that many women there, right? And some people have said, well, creativity, this is great famous English psychologist Hans Eysenck said, well, creativity, genius is something that is strictly for men, and for whatever reason, right? Which is kind of bizarre, but if you were to look at the lists, you would say, well, is he right? But then you realize, well, if women weren't allowed to participate in those domains where you could win a Nobel Prize, because they weren't really allowed entry into physics departments, let alone at the highest level, women couldn't paint nudes, women couldn't perform in public. I mean, there was this whole setup that prevented women from participating in the domains where you could be recognized as a genius, right? And as a psychologist, Eysenck wasn't paying attention to that, but which is one of the reasons why both the degrees are transdisciplinary. In other words, we don't look at something through the lens of a discipline, right? Because if I'm a psychologist and I see, well, where are the women? I think, well, there must be something wrong with the women. Maybe it's their motivation. Maybe, maybe it's their brains that are a little different. Maybe it's genetic. As a psychologist, you don't look at the environment and you don't look at the social obstacles, right? So that's why it's important to have that broader view. Otherwise, you don't get the full picture. But I also became interested in, well, maybe they didn't win any Nobel Prizes, but does that mean that in all that time women weren't being creative? And then I started looking at the women in my life, if you will, particularly my mother, right? And well, of course, my mother was being very creative, but it's a different kind of creativity, and the kind of creativity that's now referred to as everyday creativity, which is also desperately needed, right? Certainly for kids growing up, but in our everyday relationships, we need that everyday creativity. And for the longest time, that wasn't recognized. Creativity was only, well, your great theory or your great painting or your great symphony, but it wasn't, how do you live your life creatively? And even more important, do you live it in a way that's relationally creative? In other words, that stimulates other people's creativity as well, right? So there was a lot going on there. So I'm very grateful for Riane, for turning me on to this whole idea, because it became very important for me. And Riane and I went on to write a couple of articles about creativity and women, and one that came out actually in the Journal of Partnership Studies. So it's out there, and it's worth taking a look at, I think.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll definitely include the links to these articles and references that Alfonso are referring to in the show notes for today. And yeah, this example of the lack of women being represented in creativity is just yet one more example of the devaluing of caring and caregiving that Riane
absolutely
about.
Absolutely.
You are listening to the Power of Partnership podcast. We hope you are enjoying today's episode and you will consider joining our family of sponsors. Or you can help us attract sponsors by downloading, following, or subscribing to the series and liking and rating each episode you view on YouTube. We also would love to hear from you, including if you have a partnership story that you would like to share. Reach out to us at center@partnershipway.org. And now, back to today's episode. So let's talk a little bit more about creativity. As you mentioned, you are a musician and you perform with your internationally well-known wife, Kitty Margolis, who is a jazz singer. So can you share your thoughts about the awareness of partnership over the decades has impacted your music and your life as a musician?
Yeah, I mean, I think jazz offers a very interesting way of seeing partnership in a way, because jazz musicians, we tend to think of the soloist typically as the most important person at any point, right? But if you talk to jazz musicians, you'll realize that what is also deeply valued there is the ability to support the soloist. So there's both this sense of standing out, but also of supporting the piano player, the bass player, the drummer, the horns. Everybody can support each other, right? And as a saxophone player, you don't often hear saxophones playing on their own unless it's on a street corner. So you always have like a piano player or a guitar player behind you to provide chords. And there are people who really know how to do that beautifully, and there are people who are less capable of providing that support. So it's a metaphor that has also become popular in organizations. So this idea of collective creativity, but also of improvisation. And when you're improvising, one of the things that is essential is to listen. You have to listen to everybody in the band. And if you don't listen, you can tell the musician who's only interested in themselves and isn't really paying attention to what anybody else is doing, because, hey, this is me, right? And so, so in that sense, it's a very rich avenue for understanding partnership, for understanding a generative collaboration, and so on. So yeah, it's been fascinating for me to see my wife as a leader, leading bands that are most of the time made up almost entirely of men. She's worked with a terrific female drummer. It also became clear, when we auditioned for people for a tour or for a band, for a recording or something, that there are men who are consciously or unconsciously not able to accept a woman as a leader of a band, right? Even people that you wouldn't necessarily expect it from, you could tell that, that they turn around so they don't have to see her if she's guiding the band. It's very interesting dynamic. It's been so eye-opening and painful. Or to see, there's always some guy who doesn't know the first thing about jazz who will inevitably not listen to what she has to say and pontificate about music, endlessly lecture her about music. And we're both sort of sitting there and our eyes are spinning in the back of our heads.
So, Alfonso, how have you seen your work change over the decades?
Well, one thing that's happening is that there's a greater sense of urgency. There's really a sense, obviously also with the election coming up, that we're reaching a point where things are really serious, and the future isn't just something far off in the distance. One of the things that's also been very interesting is that there is a whole strand of new research in psychology that says, well, we've been looking at the effects of the past on people, right? Oh, my father, my mother, my peers growing up. But now they're finding that our assumptions and beliefs about the future have a very strong effect on how we behave and how we feel today. Because if I feel that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and I'm 16, I'll end up engaging in riskier behavior, take dangerous drugs, maybe get into fights, maybe. So these kinds, there's an awareness that the future, and by the future, I mean our ideas about the future, are having a strong, very strong effect on what we do today, and particularly for young people, but also for older people. So that awareness, I think, has really energized me to say, look, we really need to think about how we think about the future and what we can do about it and how we can participate. Because people say, well, I'm just one person. It's hopeless. What am I going to do? But there are ways of developing at least a sense of agency and a sense of I can do something about how I live my life and also how I relate to other people. Even because people think that, well, small gestures don't mean anything, but they mean a lot. They mean a lot. So it's not just, we have a lot of students who come in and say, well, I want to change the world. So yes, of course they want to change the world. And let's say, for instance, shift from a dominator to a partnership world. But one of the ways that we can do that is by embodying that in our own behavior, in the way that we interact with people on an everyday basis, which is why we talk about transformative leadership as it's everyday leadership. It's not just, when I'm the president of this or when I'm the leader of that organization. It's how we behave every day with our partner, with our friends, with the people that we might never see again in a store or on the street and so on. So we're working on sort of trying to get it so that people have more of a sense of I'm participating, I can make a difference, and I can look at the world differently.
Beautiful. So can you speak a bit more about your work as an author?
Sure, yeah. Actually, my first trade book was called From Power to Partnership, and it came out in 1993. And it was inspired very much by Riane's ideas, obviously. And it was based on my PhD dissertation, which was also about the future and change. And what I did was interview Isabel Allende and Edgar Mitchell and Ashley Montague and any number of interesting people who I thought embodied that spirit of partnership, so that people would get a sense of, well, how do people use this sort of in their everyday lives, right? And since then, I've written a lot about sort of the three main areas that I talked about in that book, because I talk about partnership, I talk about creativity, and I talk about complexity. And I've mentioned already how creativity for me is relevant because partnership is something that we have to create together. Because of living what is ultimately in a dominator system, that ends up being a default setting for a lot of us. And so we have to create these alternatives together. And so creativity has to be mobilized, not just for art or science, but also for how do we create relationships at all sorts of levels and organizations and so on that embody partnership. But also complexity, which is very much related to the idea of systems thinking, that we have to think systemically, relationally, rather than in terms of little fragments, right? I mean, we're used to thinking of analysis. So, well, I have to study this, so I'll analyze it, which means breaking it apart. But then you lose all the connections. So that our sort of default way of thinking has been anti-relational in a way, right? I'm working on a book on the relationship between creativity and diversity. Because again, we hear a lot about problems associated with diversity and people not getting along. But in fact, particularly for me as a musician, I see that so many of the greatest developments in human history come about when people from different cultures, from different backgrounds, come together and in this case, create new music. The interaction of cultures has been incredibly beneficial. It's brought problems, but that's also why we need to approach it in what Riane call partnership frame of mind that leverages the creativity rather than, well, you're different, let me show you who's boss. Right? So really, that's been what I've droned on about for the last 30 years. And I am happy now to see that students are also getting excited by these ideas and seeing how you can sort of create an alternative a worldview or an alternative mindset with which to approach the world. Because clearly what we have now isn't working. And it's becoming more and more obvious every day.
So Alfonso, before we close, I wonder if you have any final words that you'd like to share with our audience today.
Yes. I mean, I think particularly at a moment like this one, that's in a way, it's a big ask, right? But I would say don't despair. One of the things that I've found is that there are any number of alternative ways of thinking, ways of acting, ways of being in the world out there, and that people are engaging them already. So there are alternatives. They work. They're being used. People are engaging in them, and it's unlikely that we'll find out a lot about them in sort of mainstream media and typical sources, but they're out there. They're out there, and there are people doing fantastic work like Riane, and that can really help shift our mindset and also make us work towards something positive rather than recoil from the negative. So, in this sense, it's time to accentuate the positive because we can do it. We can do it. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, I want to thank you again for this conversation today.
Thank you, Harry. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you for listening to the Power of Partnership podcast. We're grateful to Rising Appalachia for the use of resilience as our Power of Partnership theme music. If you would like us to feature your partnership story, or if you would like to be a proud sponsor of the Power of Partnership podcast, please contact us at center@partnershipway.org. We hope you enjoyed this episode and will leave us a review on your favorite podcast channel. And don't forget to subscribe to be notified when new episodes are released every other Tuesday. I'm Cherry Jacobs Pruitt. See you next time on the Power of Partnership podcast.
I am resilient. I trust the movement. I negate the chaos. Uplift the negative. I'll show up at the table again and again and again. I'll close my mouth and learn to live.